Trell. I'll now yield myself 5 minutes. Director Goldstein, I had an opportunity to read your report from, I think it was June of '09, where you did an assessment of the Federal Protection Service, and it was very, very helpful. I was wondering, I'm not sure if it was a fair point in time to take a snapshot, however. I know that up until 2007, the Federal Protection Service was in the process of scaling down, downsizing. And then Congress in 2008 said, stop downsizing, start hiring. We came in with a minimum staffing requirement of, I think, 1,400. And so then FBS had to reverse what they were doing and start hiring, which they were not prepared to do. And that's when you took the snapshot. So there's some difficulty here transitioning from one function to the other, or one policy to the other. I'm just wondering if you've had a more recent opportunity to do that analysis. I know you had folks, or perhaps you yourself went to various facilities and did this assessment. You talked to customers. You talked to a lot of people. I thought the report was fairly comprehensive in terms of the number of districts that you had reached out to. But is there a more recent assessment that you've made in terms of the readiness of the Federal Protective Service and its ability to meet Congress's more recent mandate?
Mr. Chairman, we've done a number of reports, as you know, over the years. In 2008, we issued a report which was sort of our more recent baseline report, which began to reveal a lot of the issues that were coming about as a result of the downsizing that the agency was undergoing. As you mentioned, since then a floor has been placed at 1,250 individuals, about 950 of whom must be law enforcement officers. We have done additional work since that time. We issued a report on human capital planning at the Federal Protective Service. We did testimony, preliminary findings, which you're referring to, from last summer, in which we did a variety of things, including some penetration testing of federal buildings, as well as looking at the contract guard program. We will shortly issue a final report looking at those issues to a number of committees of Congress that requested that work. So we are continuing to do work on the agency, and there are some additional reports that Congress has requested that we also do, including taking a look at the transition into NPPD, as well as taking a look at RAMP and whether RAMP will be a successful program in helping the agency. So we have continuing work on the way.
One of the problems that I have in making an assessment of all federal facilities and security at those facilities is that you've got the legislative branch and we have the Capitol Police. We've got our own sort of sorry. One of the problems that I have, thank you, sir, thank you. One of the problems I have in assessing system-wide federal security is that, for example, here on Capitol Hill, the legislative branch, we have the Capitol Police. We sort of have our own security system that we operate, as does the federal court system. They sort of have they have the marshals inside the building. They've got FPS outside. We have the Capitol Police. It's really it's sort of organic. Each agency, DOD does their own thing, and so it's tough to take one measurement. Is there a study or review that you're undertaking now that would help me with that, or are you just responding as requested from these different committees?
Most of our time up until now we've focused on the Federal Protective Service because of the GSA properties, but we have received recent requests from the House Homeland Security Committee to examine just what you're suggesting, which is more broadly taking a look at how security of federal property across the entire spectrum is managed, who's responsible for it, how it interacts, how they coordinate, what kind of challenges they face. So we will be beginning that work soon, sir.
All right. I guess what I'm asking, are there gaps in what we're requesting in order to get a good sense of what is going on and what the entire picture is here in the federal government?
We've recently received a number of requests from House Homeland Security, which I think fills a lot of those gaps, but I will be happy to take a look at what we do have in that we're supposed to begin to work on and talk with your staff about some of those gaps. Yes, sir.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. Chair now recognizes Mr. Chaffetz, our ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldstein, if we could start. Use the word confusion when you're talking about the interaction with local law enforcement responding to situations in federal buildings. Can we expand on that just a little bit more? Because there are multiple jurisdictions that often would respond to some sort of incident, but explain to us a little bit more what you meant by confusion that is out there.
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to. Several years ago, in 2008, when we began discussions with the Federal Protective Service on their relationships with local police, at that time they explained to us that as they were decreasing the size of FPS, they would be relying more on local law enforcement and entering into memorandums of understanding with local law enforcement around the country to assist them in times of emergency. Over time, they realized that those MOUs probably would not be sustainable because many local law enforcement entities have enough of their own problems going on and would not wish to enter into such agreements, and that ultimately is what they found. What they told us at the time is that they were continuing, however, to develop relationships with local law enforcement, and that they had sort of more informal and ad hoc relationships to help them in times of emergency. And that, I suspect, is true. We often see local law enforcement responding to the scene when situations occur. However, what has concerned us is we've done interviews in the course of our audit work in which we have spoken to precinct commanders, for instance, in a major metropolitan area, literally within sight of level 4 federal buildings, major level 4 buildings, who had no idea of when the last time they saw an FPS officer was, what kind of relationship existed with that building a block or 2 blocks away, and what their responsibility would be in an occurrence.
Let's do that. My guess is, my sense, based on what the chairman was also asking, this is something we'd like to explore further and learn a lot more about.
Yes,
so
sir. We'd be happy
if we could, that would be great.
To explore that with the staff. Yes, sir.
Can you help me, particularly Mr. Schenkel, understand, at least over the last 24 to 36 months, 2 to 3 years, what is the trend in the number of people that are working and helping to secure? If you can push that and bring it real close. They have to be real close to the mouth. Yeah.
Okay. It's been very positive. When we get the relief as a result of the 2008 Omnibus Bill, we were able to hire an additional 150 FPS inspectors. In addition to that, we were able to revamp the training curriculum at the Physical Security Training Program, our in-house academy down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We have...
And again, I'm sorry to cut you off. I only got just 5 minutes, and I want to touch on 2 other subjects. So if you could provide us in the committee some additional details as to where that staffing is going for both the physical infrastructure and some of the other issues, that would be great. And then if you could also, you mentioned 600,000, the confiscation of 600,000 plus prohibited items.
Yes, sir.
I would love to see what's on that list, and if there's a detail as to how many of knives or how many this or that. I'm Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned about this not only in these facilities but also at airports as well. I think we need to look at what are we going to do about it? Is there enough of a deterrent, if you will, to trying to get or bring these items in? I'm sure a lot of them happen accidentally, but we're not talking about oversized shampoos here, is my guess. My guess is we're talking about something that's a little bit more nefarious in its nature. I recognize the demand on the security personnel to have to be right all of the time, but I worry that these numbers are so huge, and I've heard similar things at the TSA as well. So I'd like to explore that and get additional information about that as we move forward, because that's just not acceptable to have so many prohibited items trying to be pushed and moved through the system. Obviously, there's room for error along the way. So my time is concluding here, so I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schenkel, you are perhaps, I'm sure, I should not even say perhaps, aware of Mr. Goldstein's testimony some months back, where the GAO used testers who were able to smuggle bomb parts into, I think it was perhaps as many as 10 federal facilities, take them into a men's room, and, if necessary, assemble them. Can you tell this subcommittee today that that has been corrected, since it's at least a year old, I think, that testimony was offered?
Yes, ma'am. We've taken dramatic steps as a result of that.
Mr. Schenkel, could you pull that microphone a little closer to you and just make sure to turn it on?
This is odd. Usually they're telling me to be quiet.
Not here.
Yes, sir. We've taken a number of steps as a result of the penetration test that the GAO conducted, to include we initiated a gap analysis to identify where those problems came from. We revamped the X-ray magnetometer training. We have initiated the National Weapons Detection Program, which is an additional 16 hours of magnetometer and X-ray training for all of our protective security officers. We have also instituted the covert testing working group, which I mentioned in my initial testimony, where our individual criminal investigators, with a standardized uniform policy and a standardized uniform testing kit, have...
Mr. Schenkel, we have a call into my office from someone who called himself a Federal Protective Services employee, who said to us that the FPS plans to eliminate its hazmat program. And of course, these are the programs that monitor dangerous packages and provide training for such monitoring. Is the FPS planning to eliminate its hazmat program?
No, ma'am, it is not.
Is it still the case that we have a proliferation of guards who remain stationary and cannot leave their posts even to assist a Federal Protective Service officer?
It depends on the building and the responsibilities
Who
of that
decides
post.
that, Mr. Schenkel?
It's a combination of the Facility Security Committee that writes the post orders and the
And the
relationship...
Facility Security Committee within each building?
Yes, ma'am.
That's my problem, Mr. Schenkel. You know, if you are a very highly qualified employee at HHS, you don't know a hill of beans about security. The delegation of so much of security to internal committees almost guarantees that what Mr. Goldstein found will happen. Mr. Schenkel, we know, and there has been testimony, that these guards not only can't leave their posts, they believe if they do leave their posts, even to engage in a chase on their own or assisting an FPS officer, they may face liability. Is that the case? Have they been told that if you leave your post, somebody's coming in with a gun, he runs? Should the guard, not the FPS officer, you have a proliferation of guards, not FPS officers, should that guard run after that person who's trying to run away with a gun or with whatever he has in his hand?
That's an identified training gap that we take on the responsibility for. We have to ensure that those guards are aware that they are not on their own personal liability when those kinds of instances happen.
What is so scary about testimony after testimony is this has been the case ever since guards have been used. Is that not the case, Mr. Goldstein? I mean, this could have been corrected many years ago, but this policy of not leaving your post has been the policy all along, has it not, Mr. Goldstein?
That's my understanding, ma'am.
How is it that with the Congress having said you should have no fewer than 1,200 officers, Mr. Goldstein reports that the FPS officers are on something called reduced hours? Why would they be on reduced hours?
I'm not aware of that, ma'am. If anything,
Mr.
they're
Goldstein,
on extended hours.
you say in your testimony, you report reduced hours. That's where I got it from.
Yes, ma'am. What we're referring to is during the period of time, certainly, that the Federal Protective Service was reducing its personnel, its officers, the law enforcement security officers and the remaining patrol officers, the FPS made a decision that in most places there would not be weekend hours, there would not be hours.
Mr. Schenkel, if there are federal employees in a building during weekend hours, is there Federal Protective Service service there during those hours?
It depends on the location, ma'am.
And again, who decides that, Mr. Schenkel?
It's a combination of the needs of the facilities, if they are isolated facilities, and/or of the region, if they are in a regional facility. There is 24/7 coverage
Mr. Schenkel,
here in
isn't it
NCR.
true that the internal committee is who basically is making these decisions, not your officers?
In some cases, but not in all cases.
I think this is a very serious proposition, Mr. Chairman, that security is in the hands of civilians who happen to be sitting on these committees and who, given the power, is going to use it as they see fit. Is that not the case, Mr. Goldstein?
We have found a number of weaknesses with the building security committees, now called facility security committees. They are made up of representatives from the tenant agencies. Usually the largest tenant agency in the individual building serves as the chair. I have attended a number of these meetings over the years just to see how they operate. And while I think they are well-intentioned, and they certainly should have an advisory role, we have been concerned that you have a very balkanized, fragmented approach to the security of GSA's portfolio, and every building gets to make significant decisions about security, how security is managed, as opposed to FPS being allowed to do a portfolio-wide approach that's based on risk management principles.
Yeah, as competent and dedicated as, for that matter, a member of Congress may be, who is my colleague, I don't want that member of Congress deciding security for entry into this building. And, Mr. Chairman, may I just say, finally, in closing, that the time has come, I think, for the committees who've been concerned about this to mandate that security be in the hands of trained security officials. And I would like very much to work with you, your ranking member, and to ask the members of the Homeland Security Committee and the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which also has some jurisdiction over FPS employees, to all get together. Maybe if we gang up on this problem, we can get better security for federal employees.
Funded through a security fee of charges per square foot. At this point, it's up to 66 cents a square foot. And what happens is these agencies see all this money flowing to FPS. They get decreased services year by year.
So how do they pay for the outsourced police forces that they set up without any expertise of their own?
I don't know.
See, here you have FPS saying you've got to have it per square foot, and they say, okay, since nobody is compelling me to use them, who cares about those standards? Let's just hire our own independent police force and make our own standards. And how anybody can tell me that's going to protect the IRS or any other agency, I don't know. But I think it important to note that we're not here talking about what FPS does or shouldn't do. We're talking about the existence of an auxiliary police forces, or I should say alternative police forces, in agencies where at will they can decide who they are, what their standards are, with virtually no federal oversight through the FPS, or for that matter through the Department of Homeland Security. What's the relationship, Mr. Adler or Mr. Wright, of the FPS to the local police forces of a particular city or county?
It varies. I think Director Schenkel hit on it, but in my experience, what I've seen, there can be a commonality, there can be a camaraderie, but ultimately, most of local law enforcement, first of all, they're not allowed to carry within a federal facility. Most of them aren't familiar with the layout, so if you rang the alarm and they came, they might find the front door, but they may not be familiar with the layout. I think the role of local law enforcement, to put it in proper perspective, is really to arrive on the scene quickly to provide perimeter security, crowd control, but really it's incumbent upon the police officers, the law enforcement components within the building, working for the agencies to respond and prevent the situation from going from bad to worse.
And I think that's important to the record, Mr. Chairman, since Mr. Schenkel said they depend on local police forces. And the notion that busy police forces should do anything but what they would do anyway if there was something on the outside of the business is very disconcerting to hear. Mr. Chairman, if I could just conclude by noting that in Mr. Wright's testimony, and ask him if he knows what these cities are, he says that at a minimum, around, I'm looking at page, it isn't numbered, it's under FPS structural problems. At a minimum, around-the-clock protection by federal law enforcement officers should be provided in the 18 to 22 cities with the greatest concentration of employees, meaning federal employees, and facilities. And I think you say that 24-hour service is only provided in 2 cities. What are those cities?
Can I approach that off the record? I'm not sure I should say in a
If
public
you,
setting.
yes, could you
Yes.
make sure that the chairman understands
Yes, I
that?
think you'll be very surprised.
Yeah.
As
That
to
the
who
chairman
doesn't
gets
have
that in camera so we can understand that. I just think that what we know what those, almost anybody could guess what those 18 cities, 18 of 22 cities with the greatest concentration are, and everybody would know that those are the cities that we regard as most targeted. And what your testimony here today has informed us is that we got to get on the stick. What happened to our IRS with extraordinary sadness from all of us was a kamikaze event of the kind that perhaps no police force of any kind could have deterred, but it certainly ought to be a shot across our so-called bow to remember that this is not the kind of attacks we should be expecting, especially in IRS offices. I have found, I work very closely with the IRS here, I have found IRS employees to be among the most collegial, the most customer-oriented employees in the United States government. But if you're out here in this recession, paying taxes, lost your job, house gone, and you can't find anybody else to be mad at, there's always your local IRS employee, and we have a duty to protect these employees every day of the week that they are on duty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kelly, and welcome. I'm sorry I was stuck up here the other day, and I thank you for your kind introduction in my absence. In your prepared statement, you made reference to the fact that you were shocked at some statements by certain public officials after the tragedy in Austin. Would you elaborate?
There was a member of the House of Representatives who, I don't have the quotes in front of me, so I would not want to misquote. I'm sure most have seen them in the press, and I'd be glad to provide them. And when I issued statements, and also to a member of the Senate, and when I issued statements expressing shock and disappointment and looking for an apology, they were not forthcoming. Those apologies have never been forthcoming. And I think that it's outrageous that anyone would make statements like those that have been made, much less someone in, anyone in a public position that should be supporting federal employees who are just trying to do their jobs.
If you want to provide more for the record,
I will be glad to do that.
it would be welcome. Thank you. Mr. Adler, could you elaborate a little bit? You spoke fast, and although I'm originally from Boston, I have lived in the South so long now, I have trouble sometimes following a fast presentation. But you were making a point about the difference between, if I understood your testimony, GSA's first screen versus, say, the Israeli approach to security. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, we've been addressing this in the TSA venue as well. The concept of taking proactive steps in the law enforcement security arena to not simply sit back and become reactionary, become a duck in a barrel, if you will, and pray that the barrel is durable enough to withstand the attack. Be proactive, but of course, it's very convenient for me to come here and say we should be proactive. You need resources to accomplish that. You need human beings in uniforms with training and capability and authority to do it. And, and out of respect to Director Schenkel, he's making do with what he has, whether it's setting MOUs with local law enforcement or anyone else. Ideally, we would have enough. We're talking about whether we have police officers or inspectors. I'd like all of the above. I'd love to have police officers at every law enforcement or federal government facility, but that would enable us to take a more proactive approach, to have the proper equipment like cameras and so forth, so we can monitor the area, have the plainclothes contingent out there who are trained in behavioral actions and just things, little indicators we can pick up. I mean, I know firsthand FPS does an excellent job of that at 26 Federal Plaza in New York. You know, that's the sort of thing that we do want to have happen, but once again, the starting point is having the resources to engage in that type of proactive, investigative security law enforcement activities.
Although, as Mr. Miller of the other panel indicated, all of that, if we did everything you just said, it still would not have prevented the terrorist attack in Austin.
Correct. There's two aspects we're talking about here for this hearing. One is prevention, the other is response. We have to concede, Colleen mentioned the plane coming into the building. We concede that. Then we're defined how we respond. So taking it from initially, you know, the Israeli approach will minimize the prevention side of things. But, and as we all know, human error will occur. Something will get in, whether it's an active shooter or an explosive device. The question then is, what are we trained and capable of doing in response? So that was the other side of what I was trying to present.
All right. Thank you. In your testimony, you also said, if I heard you correctly, that the IRS puts both the public and its own employees at risk. What were you referring to?
I was referring to quotations that were sent to me. I received a lot of emails. I requested input. I have 65 agencies we represent. Each one has an agency representative. So when the email goes out, they survey the input. What that was reflecting was, I think it's a lot of frustration among my CID special agent members who are concerned that they want to passionately get involved. They listen to what Colleen describes, and they feel as if they have to make it up at game time. You can't wing it. You have to plan for it. And you have to, you know, step up and recognize IRS is always going to be a threatened component by virtue of what they do. So you have to commit resources to training the special agents who are there, who are the first responders, to make sure they're not going to make it up when it happens, to make sure they don't have to rely upon somebody who takes the initiative and a heroic ability to help in a fire drill or put someone on their back. They should plan. And that will minimize, or actually will increase their effectiveness in responding to one of these types of attacks.
And in what little time I have left, Mr. Wright, you talked about the FPS being dysfunctional, citing some studies that would say that. If you have a series of recommendations, I'd welcome seeing them. One quick question. Do you have a view about the relative merits between, say, a federal guard, federal employee, versus contract security?
As stated earlier, private guards have basically a mishmash of authority across the U.S. Every city, every state is different. The benefits to having a federal guard are more likely, our more likely recommendation is federal police officers like you have here at the Capitol, is they are FLETC trained and they have that federal authority to immediately stop and detain threats or take action against individuals that enter the property. What we see now, and I'll be glad to share later on the record, a major city where it's been documented. Now, I've always had the anecdotal evidence over the years that guards, private guards, are afraid to put their hands on anyone. We've got documented cases of individuals running from FPS police officers and guards standing by. And just here in the last couple of days, I received some very disturbing information where it's been absolutely documented in our Operation Shield efforts across the country that these guards are witnessing threats or witnessing our attempts to penetrate. We're witnessing these guards say, I can't do anything. I have to stop. If I see something on that that X-ray screen that looks threatening, I'm not going to stop that individual. I'm going to call FPS, or I'm going to, in some cases, I'm going to call the company first. So that's the problem. Federal officers would have that authority right here, right now, stop that individual, take him down, and do what has to be done. You have a lot of private officers out there that are afraid for their own liability.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I want to thank the members of the panel, for your willingness to come before the Congress and offer your suggestions and offer your testimony. I'm going to leave the record open for 3 days for those members who are in other committees and haven't had an opportunity to ask questions. But other than that, we appreciate your testimony here today, and we bid you good day. This subcommittee is now adjourned.